Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Levi Darby, and I serve as Director of Jewish Life at the Peninsula Jewish Community Center. It's my pleasure this evening to welcome you to the second session of Grappling with Race in America. In this session, we will explore issues related to criminal justice reform and police reform. The program is presented by the PJCC and the Synagogues of the North Peninsula in order to enable our community to grapple with the realities of racism and injustice, and to engage in open and honest conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion in our community. I'm immensely grateful to the rabbis of our congregations for their collegiality and partnership in creating this program. And I also want to express our community's thanks to the Jewish Community Federation and Endowment Fund, whose generous funding made this program possible. This series is presented in conjunction with the Jewish Community Relations Council, whose mission is to educate and advocate on issues of vital importance to the organized Jewish community based on consensus, civility, and an expanded commitment to living Jewish values of social justice. I especially want to thank Jessica Trubowitz, Public Policy and Community Building Director of the JCRC, whose guidance and support in planning this series has been invaluable. This series is designed as a webinar, so only the speakers will be visible or heard. We do hope you will actively participate in the program by putting your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and our speaker will answer as many of your questions as time permits. If you do have a question, it will be seen if you put it in the Q&A box. If you put it in the chat, it may not be seen. Please be aware also that this session will be recorded. And now I'm delighted to introduce Paul Henderson, our speaker for this evening. Director Henderson has spent his entire professional career working in public service for the city of San Francisco, and most recently was appointed director of the Department of Police Accountability, where he and his legal team are tasked with investigating all complaints regarding police use of force and misconduct. The prestigious Office of San Francisco's Civilian Oversight represents award-winning practices of police reforms defined by 21st century policing models. Prior to this appointment, Director Henderson spent 7 years as the Deputy Chief of Staff and Public Safety Director to the former mayor of the city of San Francisco, Edwin Lee. As a principal advisor to the mayor, he was responsible for the development and implementation, He was responsible for the development and implementation of strategic policy and administration on major issues affecting the city, with an emphasis again on the criminal justice system. Director Henderson sits on the editorial board for California Lawyer magazine and is a contributing writer to Politico.com. He also appears regularly on MSNBC, CNN, PBS, and is the on-air legal analyst for the San Francisco affiliate of CBS News. Director Henderson, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate that glowing introduction. And I also appreciate, but let me just clarify for our audience, I think there was a reference in the previous material that it was Dr. Henderson, and no one was more disappointed than my mother, but it's JD, lawyer. But I appreciate the uplift from the description. So thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to have this discussion. I'm actually grateful that so many people want to talk about these topics because I think they're very important right now. And so Just a little bit more about me in terms of how I got to these positions and the work that I've done. I'm a fourth generation San Francisco Siskin. My family's been here. I've been here for a long time. I grew up in the Bayview, which is one of the minority communities, one of the last minority communities here in San Francisco, and not in a financially well-off area of the city. My mother was a public defender here in San Francisco, and my grandmother was a civil rights investigator for the federal government. And so I grew up here with a very strong sense of race and a sense of frustration in a big city, feeling like things happened to my community rather than for my community. And my tool for addressing that was education. I really wanted to learn. I really wanted to understand why things were different in my block than from my peers or other people that I saw around me. That drew me to law school. And every day was a new awakening as I understood how the law worked, but more importantly, how the law worked disparately and disproportionately against communities of color. And I felt it necessary to work in those fields, specifically in public service. And let me just say that my family in the beginning was not so excited when I had decided that I wanted to work in prosecution and become a district attorney. But part of my reasoning and part of the analysis from that was feeling like I wanted to have a voice on the side of the table where decisions were being made about defining public service and decisions were being made about sentencing and accountability. And I thought voices needed to be heard that came from the communities that were most affected by many of the laws that I saw being used in the criminal justice system. And so that's what drew me to the district attorney's office in the first place. And when I started at the district attorney's office here in San Francisco, I was the first African-American that the office had hired in 5 years. That means there had not been an intern or a paralegal, a secretary, let alone a lawyer that had been brought into that office for quite a long time. And that was a real challenge for me. On my first day in court, I remember distinctly, it was one of those defining moments, as Oprah would say. I had stayed up all night looking at all of my cases so I could make sure that I was fully prepared. I came in with my box into the courtroom, excited to be a lawyer and a trial attorney. And the judge stopped me before the court began to tell me that I would have to leave and move and wait until my lawyer showed up to represent me. And then he leaned over further and said, and by the way, you're on the wrong side of the courtroom as well, because that's the side where the DA is going to be, and you don't want to be on that side of the table. And I remember so clearly, it's like one of those things that happen and like time slows down and you're like, oh my gosh, what is happening here? But the feeling that I had was not one of embarrassment or shame, but of resolution of I need to do an even better job. I need to make sure that I represent myself that much louder, that much clearer to make sure that the next person that walks into this courtroom that may look like me is not going to come with these presumptions of criminal involvement that this judge has made about me here today. And I did lean forward into that. And I would say that my career has been a reflection of my effort and concentration from that moment, from my first day of being a lawyer here in California. I worked hard at that job and I rose through the ranks, ultimately, obviously becoming chief under then Kamala Harris, our elected district attorney. And I was her chief until she left the office and went on to the Attorney General's office, which is when I went to the mayor's office. And at the mayor's office, it was a fascinating perspective to me, working at local, state, and federal initiatives, all related to public safety, and informing my perspective of budgets, of administrations, and of the intersections that took place amongst all of these agencies defining public safety, which led me to my current position at the Department of Police Accountability. And it's fascinating work that I do in terms of civilian oversight. It's one of the areas that has been identified as best practices in dealing with race disparities in policing. And this didn't come from me, this came from the Department of Justice. There's a whole department on 21st century policing in the Department of Justice that came out under the Obama administration identifying this. And in 21st century policing, they talk about the need for civilian oversight if we really want to address real accountability in terms of policing in ways that gets us to race neutral policing. And that's really one of the goals. At the Department of Police Accountability, we're responsible for investigating, sustaining cases of misconduct, presenting informed policy recommendations to the department, as well as auditing. One of the nice things about the position that has happened over the past few years is based on the work that we've been able to do. We have been invited to the table and granted the opportunity to do oversight for the sheriff's office as well, which has opened up a whole nother lane of analysis and work in our state jails and prison systems, reviewing and seeing how folks are treated in custody as well. Very, very interesting to me from an intellectual perspective, from folks that have diminished civil rights because they are in custody, and what those standards are for equal treatment, especially when you start talking about race and the disparities. And I think that that's very important. I don't think we can have a conversation about our justice system without having a conversation about race. And let me be the first to admit it, talking about race can be difficult. But if we are not intentional about having those conversations with race, they will not happen. And so one of the things that I'm grateful for in the work that I'm doing and the work that I've done is being able to force some of those conversations to the forefront in order for us to address some of the subjective and intransigent problems associated not just with policing, but with our criminal justice system in whole. So I want to talk a little bit about that, because I think it's important about where we are right now in this country, not just in the state of California and not just in the Bay Area, because demands have been made for decades about justice now. But I think we are at a place in time where we are capturing an entire movement that is more than a moment, beyond just the civil unrest that we've seen over the past few months and in the past year, addressing race disparities specifically in our justice system. We've all seen many of the big cases throughout history that have informed the frustration that I think many communities are feeling, specifically communities of color, with big cases like the Trayvon Martin case, the Breonna Taylor, the George Floyd case now, and Ahmaud Arbery, all of them capturing moments and videos that are difficult to see and difficult to justify in terms of the outcomes associated with transgressions that we've seen, specifically, again, involving communities of color and involvement with law enforcement agencies. And so I think the work that I'm doing is more necessary than ever right now in this moment. And I think it's led to some of the calls that we've seen, some of the civil unrest that we've seen, but also some of the calls that we have seen throughout this country for, like, the defund the police movement. And that's it's a complicated but uncomplicated issue that I want to just take a moment to try and unpack for a little while, to talk about why I think it's relevant and what the movement really is. And I think folks on across the spectrum try and interpret what they believe defund the police to mean, but I believe at its base or at its core, what it is are a number of communities calling for accountability for funding for the police department. But let me give you context to explain it further. When the movement started of defund the police was coming at a time, and this is the summer of last year, while this country was facing in the middle of a pandemic. We're still in it. But at the time, many people were shifting to working from home, watching more television, seeing many of the cases that I was referencing earlier, and at the same time, dealing with local budgets addressing law enforcement agencies. Now, for most large cities, their police department and law enforcement departments are their largest ticket item, meaning that's the largest part of their budgets. And as we are asking for communities to approve budgets and reevaluate priorities amongst budgets, I believe communities of color are raising the issues and asking questions about what tax dollars are being spent for in terms of policing, especially when paying those tax dollars is an adoptive admission or an acceptance of the race disparities that we know to be built into our systems. And so, however you approach it, I believe that part of defund the police and its movement is, if nothing else, a call for more communities to sit at the table in defining what budgets look like for law enforcement agencies. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more when we start talking about what some of those race disparities are in general and with law enforcement. But I think the ultimate duty and the ultimate call was a recognition specifically for communities of color that they had a duty to stop law enforcement from doing wrong things that was just as important as defining the need for them to do the right things in public safety. And so that said, let's talk a little bit about what some of those disparities are, because I think that that drives the train in terms of what some of the challenges have been and what some of the challenges continue to be in this country. Right now, there's a problem, and there has been a problem for a while with mass incarceration and overpopulations of our jails and prisons. And that is an issue, and that's at the end of our criminal justice pipeline. Obviously, we start with an arrest, then you go through the criminal justice system, and then you end up in jail and or prison. That's the spectrum. And when we look at the end of that spectrum, and when we analyze and we're looking at the jails and the prisons, we see the overlay of race greatly impacting those systems. If we were to remove race from the disproportionate outcomes from folks entering into our criminal justice system, and this is specifically with both African Americans and Latinx populations, if we were to remove the race disparities from those populations, our prison populations would be cut by over 40%. That's the deep impact on race. And in terms of our tax dollars and funds and drains on society, that's a high cost to pay for race in the definition of mass incarceration. African Americans are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of white people in this country. And for women, it's double for African American women than from white women. When we talk about even children, our most precious commodity as a society, 52% of the children that are waived judicially into criminal courts. And now we're talking about the distinction from dependency courts, which is a 601 system, into criminal courts, the 602 system. 52% of those kids are African American. And keep in mind that African American children are 14% of the population, but they are incarcerated at 5 times the rate for incarceration African American children. And when we start talking about things, even with the ultimate cost that we pay in the criminal justice system, which is the death penalty. And that's a really important thing. I'm going to come back to it in a second and talk about it in context, where 35% of everyone sentenced to death penalty are African American, and they represent just a little less than 14% of this nation's population. And so these are real numbers that we have to deal with when we talk about our justice system and our rates of incarceration specifically. And when we look at what has been going on that has led to, I believe, much of the civil unrest that we're experiencing in this country right now, these are the numbers behind it. These are the real people and communities behind it. And again, we have to speak to the truth of what these numbers are, that they are justice systems being defined disproportionately against communities of color. Our federal prison rate has gone up since 1980, 790%. That's how much the prison population has gone up. And that incarceration rate and imprisonment rate for African American men is, like I said, it's 10 times what it is for everyone else. And so these are real challenges that exist that define what our problems are in this country in terms of incarceration. And some of the ways that we have to approach these problems is to try and come up with better solutions that are going to be race neutral. And we have challenges with that in this country. I don't think we will ever start unpacking and defining those real challenges unless we approach it from that perspective, is that we want to make sure that we are building a system that does not have two separate tracks of justice, such that if you are entering our justice system from a person of color, that statistically you will be marginalized or impacted in a way that has a disparate outcome. That's not a system that can sustain itself. And what I believe is behind much of the civil unrest that we are experiencing right now, beyond just the names or the labels that have put on much of the unrest based on specific and individual cases. Those specific and individual cases are symbols of problems that speak beyond just those individuals that are being represented by the voices and the challenges of the large groups standing up for and speaking out, I believe, against the disparities. Specifically, I'm talking about cases like the George Floyd, and that trial is going on right now. And even when we look at that, and I presume that many of you are watching that trial as much as I am, and obviously I play a role in talking about that case to make sure that people understand what's going on in the courtroom, the implications and what it means and what it represents. But the things that have happened in Minneapolis are not unique to Minneapolis. But some of the things do stand out in Minneapolis that were behind the George Floyd trial that I think speaks to a lot of the civil unrest as well. Less than 1% of all of the complaints that were made in Minneapolis resulted in discipline action. And by the complaints, I'm talking about complaints that have been made against law enforcement in Minneapolis. And if you look at some of their statistics, where 20% of their African Americans represent just under 20% of their population, but they are over 60% of the shootings in that city. And that's just by looking over the past 10 years. And these are some of the factors, I think, that influence the frustration that many communities, and specifically communities of color, have felt about policing, obviously in Minneapolis, but in many other cities as well. And again, a lot of these stats are just facts. People may not like my interpretation or analysis of them, but the fact speaks for themselves in terms of defining disparities that we don't get to walk away from. We have to be able to start accepting that there are these disparities and we have to find solutions for them. I believe some of the bigger solutions are agencies like civilian oversight that are able to both collect data, make that data transparent, and analyze data so that we can understand what the problems are. We can't fix what we don't talk about, and we can't talk about what we don't know. And so data and transparency is always of absolute importance. And I think one of the keys to unlocking the solution to addressing the race disparities that we're speaking about. In California, we have a number of tools available to us that are highlighted with civilian oversight agencies, many of whom play a key role in making these data transparency, these data collections and analysis more transparent than not. One of the things that my agency does, in addition to reporting weekly in police commission, but we also prepare reports monthly, quarterly, and annually. Those of you that are interested in seeing some of these things, feel free to jump in and check out the website where I publish all of these things from my agency. The annual report in particular will give you an overview of how cases are handled, the kinds of cases that come in, the sentences that are given in terms of accountability, the volume. My agency handles, I think it's around 3,000 complaints that come in a year. There's an analysis and a breakdown of race. There's a summation of the policy recommendations that my agency makes that are informed by the complaints that come in to the office. All of this stuff, I think, is really part of what the real solutions are. And I face a number of questions. Let me just anticipate some of them. This is not my first rodeo. What do we do in my city? And we don't have a civilian oversight agency. What are some of the solutions there in terms of even knowing or understanding what some of the disparities or data trends are in terms of what policing looks like in my jurisdiction? Great question, and here's the answer. Some of the ways that I would encourage folks to get involved and make themselves more aware of what's going on are to review their 96A reports in California. And that's one of the statewide initiatives that forces law enforcement agencies to report race disparities in areas like stops and use of force. And those are the keys to understanding if there are race disparities. You know, a lot of folks feel like we don't have problems like this in my city. If you want confirmation of that, and this is one of the ways to evaluate it, is use the use of force to evaluate whether or not there are actual disparities in your locale. You can ask your mayor, you can ask your chief of police for that data about use of force. And this is one of the key aspects of it, because in this country, use of force is disproportionately applied towards communities of color almost 20 times. I can't remember if it's 19.3 or 19.5 times more, but it's a high number, just under 20%, that use of force is applied. And this is in the nation against communities of color. If you think that your county is different, I would suggest to you it's likely not, but check for yourself and look at that data as confirmation that there may be race disparities going on right under your nose that you may not be aware of, and then what to do with it. I think use of force is one of the more interesting aspects of analyzing race disparities, primarily because most law enforcement agencies have not updated their use of force policies in decades. It's one of the things that just stands on its own and reaffirms itself year after year after year until something intervenes to force or change the department to make those changes. And if you are not updating your use of force, now this is the really interesting part. Again, like I said, most law enforcement agencies have not updated their use of force policies in decades. And keep in mind, just to give you more context, there are over 17,000 law enforcement agencies in this country. there are less than 200 civilian oversight agencies in this country, even though the Department of Justice and 21st Century Policing has indicated that those are best practices in terms of reforms and best practices in terms of addressing disparities in policing for this country. That said, what we have without a reformed use of force policy in our jurisdiction is an adoptive admission of techniques like carotid techniques. That's the restrictions on the necks and chokeholds. We have by adoptive admissions, shooting at cars, by adoptive admission, no-knock warrants. And these are all things that have been proven to be unsafe and not reflective of best practices. And so to the degree you are in a jurisdiction that has not updated your use of force policy, you are also potentially involved in activities, or at least the subjective use of activities that are no longer and have not been best practices for a long time, again, that come with built-in disparities. And these are highlighted by the facts that things like no-knock warrants, and this is obviously at the center of the Breonna Taylor case, that no-knock warrants, part of why they don't reflect best practices are in addition to the race disparities built into the subjective execution of no-knock warrants, they are proven not to be public safety risks for law enforcement as well. Let me say that again. No-knock warrants are not best practices because they also have folded into the challenges of no-knock warrants safety risks for officers trying to execute public safety, no pun intended, for officers trying to do public safety or define public safety. And so these are real challenges, and these are some of the steps that I like to empower folks and empower broader audiences. If you have concerns about even redefining safety for your law enforcement agencies, these are some of the questions that you can be asking to define a better definition or a more updated definition, or definitions that include best practices about use of force, because they're very important. And this, again, like I said, is reflective of challenges that the majority of law enforcement agencies in this country have not taken the steps to address yet. And, you know, as equally important, these are some of the problems and challenges that come with built-in race disparities. Like I said, the overlying umbrella here is use of force. And so one of the things that we can do is ask about use of force to affirm or inquire or investigate as to whether or not there are disparities happening in many of the counties where we live already. You know, some of the challenges that we're also facing right now are that many of the challenges to the race disparities, specifically in policing, are tools that have been taken up in the past by the federal government. And so the Department of Justice and the Civil Rights Division for the Department of Justice has been the agency that has, from a federal level, evaluated pattern and practice investigations to say, hey, this department has a history of disparate treatment that needs to be investigated. When that takes place, the federal government will take over those local police jurisdictions and insert an oversight agency or an oversight individual to take over and address those race disparities. And that has happened in the past, and there are still, I believe there are 11 different cities, big cities, that have oversight still installed in them from the federal government. One of the interesting things about that, and the reason that we're talking about it now, and I think is important to talk about, is that the past administration has dismantled and cut down both that investigative process to evaluate pattern and practice investigation. So there have been no pattern and practice investigations from the last administration, but they have also shrunk that entire unit, the Civil Rights Division, to less than half of what it was from the previous administration. And so what we're talking about now, and I just want to take it to a 5,000-foot level in terms of not just to talk about politics, but to talk about the different administrations, but the current administration has inherited a division that has been decimated by the past administration in its obligation or the duties to be evaluating large numbers of departments and making determinations of pattern and practice. That, I believe, has shifted a lot of the onus to the state level and to the local levels to define for themselves a definition of public safety for the communities that they are designed to serve. And so I'm just giving you context and more information about some of the things that have happened in the past that have led us to where we are right now, and what has been behind a lot of the civil unrest that we've seen on the streets that have been happening for the past year, and I think are happening right now, that are aside from the George Floyd trial that started this week. And a lot of those protests still, in the name of George Floyd, I believe are reflective of the things that we're talking about tonight. And so, again, I'm going to close out with talking about some of the things that are also happening at a federal level in this country, because I think that they're just as relevant now. And speaking to these issues that I've raised for you already, we have pending a couple of bills, and they stalled a little bit, but now they've been reintroduced. Last week is the George Floyd bill. Previously, that was the JIPA bill. That's a term that I made up for it from the Democrat side, and that's the Justice and Policing Act. I just call it JIPA, but now it's been renamed as the George Floyd Act. And that does a number of things that I think speak at a federal level for where this country may be headed in terms of redefining policing. And again, let me just give context to all of this too. I talk a lot about the policing component, but it's not lost on me that there are still components in this pipeline that have to be addressed in terms of how folks are charged, in terms of our judicial system and our prosecutorial system and our defense system, specifically in our sentencing system. There are disparities baked into our system all along the way. I'm focusing primarily on the policing aspect and the introduction of the pipeline, the arrest aspect, and how folks are treated by law enforcement agencies, because I think that that's really important too. And obviously that's the focus of my work, so that's where I'm focusing a lot of it. But many of the numbers that I've given you are reflective of the entirety of that pipeline. So the George Floyd bill that is now pending speaks to a number of these issues, and I just want to unpack that a little bit, because I think you'll be hearing about that in addition to the George Floyd trial that's ongoing and started on Monday. And I can answer questions about that because I know all about that too, and things are happening there as well. But beyond that and behind that, and to the point of that trial, part of the reason why I think this bill is named after the George Floyd trial that's going on, is because it is reflective of the disparities in policing that the federal government is trying to address. And there's a number of things in that bill that I think are important. One, the carotid techniques are banned in that bill. And again, like I said, these are no longer, and have not been for a while, best practices, and yet many law enforcement agencies are still using it. Having leadership at the federal government to address that, I think, can be very important. And we'll see if the bill is ultimately passed. But also no-knock warrants is in that bill as well, and removed as a tool for law enforcement agencies. There's a component in that bill that diminishes qualified immunity. It doesn't take it away, but it's diminished, and the standard has changed for qualified immunity. And just so we're clear, qualified immunity are one of the legal protections that are offered to law enforcement agencies that are engaged in their duties. And that has been used as a shield against prosecution and a shield against civil liability for officers involved in their work. And I think you have to balance that with an understanding of how that qualified immunity stands up against officers who have been involved with, let's say, things as important as like officer involved shootings. I like to use that as an example because I think everybody wants to see what happens when there's an officer involved shootings, specifically because it's the use of potentially lethal force. And we already know in this country that over 98, I believe it's 98.3% of all officers involved in officer involved shootings never face criminal charges. That doesn't mean that every officer involved in an officer involved shooting should face criminal charges, but there should always be an evaluation for that process. And I think that's what this speaks to. So anyway, that is one of the things that is in the George Floyd bill, as well as a call to an end for bias. And there are dollars and acknowledgement and encouragement for more civilian oversight agencies as well. And so that's what's in the bill. I'd encourage people to look at it and understand it. I know, and it did come from the Democratic Party. So it was written by both Cory Booker and Kamala Harris when it was introduced at some point in the summer. And it's been going back and forth in committees, and I think it was just voted on last week. And so it's a relevant conversation right now. I know there is a competing Republican bill. I'm not sure what the status of it is that addresses some of the same things, but with different outcomes. So for instance, the carotid techniques that we were talking about that falls under the use of force, falls under it's restricted, but it's not banned and taken away. Nor does the Republican bill address qualified immunity in any way, shape, or form. It also, in terms of bias, instead of calling to an end to bias and to stop bias involved in policing, it calls for a training to be built in to address bias. And so there's some key differences that I think are pretty important, but I just wanted to unpack that a little bit and talk about it in case folks had an interest. Because I think a lot of people, when we talk about these things, want to know more about what is happening locally, what's happening at the state, and what's happening at the federal level. I will say there's a number of things that are happening right now, and there's a whole pool of potential legislation in the pool right now, at least at the state level, that I've been trying to help and facilitate with in some of those conversations, not the least of which will be SB 16, which is pending right now, addressing last year's bill of 1421. And 1421 is the bill about making discipline records of law enforcement agencies transparent and available. And there's still a lot of discrepancy among civilian oversight agency in terms of how and when these records can be used in the cases that they have. But the current bill that is pending will expand the definition of what can be turned over and what will be turned over. And I think it's a really interesting conversation, because what hasn't, I think, been adequately contemplated is the volume of cases that is now required to be turned over. And so while this law has been enacted for the past 2 years, it's been a Herculean task for many agencies like my own and in other cities as well to turn over the high volume of records. For an agency like mine, many of the omnibus requests that have been made from like news and media outlets asking for every single record means for an agency like mine going back to review, turn over, redact, and evaluate records that go as far back as 1982. And that includes information and evidence and details for things that are still like on cassette tapes or that are in handwritten forms that have to be redacted, evaluated, and processed for mass dissemination. Some of the more, I think, important solutions that we've come up with is my agency is using an open portal such that when records are requested and made public to any of the individuals, those documents are shared on an open portal so that they are open for other people, making the same request or that have the same interest, so that we're not recreating the wheel with every new request that come in. I think some of those best practices need to be built in throughout the state. I'd love to see more leadership addressed to making that process more uniform and effective than the current process. And the current legislation that's pending now, which will expand the definition of what those records are in terms of what gets turned over, in terms of discipline associated transactions with law enforcement, essentially puts us back at the starting line for what gets turned over. So if you change the definitions of what now may be turned over, all of the work that's been done in turning over records before has to be redone with the new standards. And so there's a lot happening with police oversight right now. There's a lot happening with this data. But again, I think data is the key to understanding what the problem is. We don't have the luxury of misunderstanding things if we don't ever look at them or understand what they are. And that's why I think the transparency is so important. I just want to make sure that beyond just the transparency that I was just focusing on in the last few minutes, we are taking the additional steps to analyze that data. And then here's the big key, right? This is the moment we've all been waiting for. What is the answer to address the disparities once we've discovered them? I believe the real answer is coming up with informed policy that is evidence-based and implementing that policy with our law enforcement agencies. And I will say that implementation, from my perspective, takes the form of training, and that training needs to be throughout the system. I mean, obviously you engage in those new policies, but a lot of that training has to be not just moving forward, but across the board. And let me explain what that means. We can't come up with the magical solution that ends race disparities just by training alone. But if we have a training program, that training program can't start tomorrow and we expect that things are finished, because we still have an entire population of law enforcement agencies that may not receive that same training. I think the training has to be defined in ways that both incorporates existing officers, including leadership, and future officers as well. And so we need to be very specific about coming up with some of these solutions, or at least understanding the problems. Because again, and I'll close with this, we're never going to fix the problems that we don't talk about. And we can't talk about the problems that we have not defined. And those definitions are sourced and begin with and end with data. They begin with the information that we know and can prove, as are the race disparities that I think we've been discussing all evening. And so I will take a pause here because they told me not to go longer than 40 minutes, and I'm at 43 minutes now. So I'm happy to answer whatever questions I can about whatever I know, and hopefully that will be helpful for this audience as well.
Director Henderson, thank you so very much for this very full and complete presentation that you've offered us. There are, as you said, a number of questions, and I want members of the audience to know that we are combining a number of different questions into one question, since they're on more or less the same topic.
Of course.
So if people in the audience don't hear their exact question being asked, at the very least, we're trying to get to them as in a combination question. So a question comes from a member of the audience who is a federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice. And his question is, what can be done at the local or federal level to improve hiring practices for law enforcement officers? He wonders what your opinion would be about a uniform hiring practice to employ a psychoanalysis to determine whether candidates have prejudices or biases or proclivity to unwarranted violence. Is there some standard that can be instituted?
That is an excellent question. I'm super excited by that one, because I actually did some of this work While I was at the mayor's office, this was one of the projects that I was tasked with, was trying to have a better understanding of um, disparities in hiring for law enforcement agencies. I would say that I think the way to address those disparities is leaning into it with intentionality. You have to say, we want to hire more women. We want to hire more people of color, and then do it. The execution is, again, the devil is always in the details, is how are you going to do it? I think that there is a broad pool of potential candidates, and you have to focus on where those candidates are and look for them. You cannot say, we would like to hire more communities of color and our doors are open. That's not enough, especially with the history we have and the perceptions that we have, both in prosecution and in law enforcement, that if you want to redefine the face of who is drawn to those jobs and who accepts those jobs and who comes to those jobs, you must look for them. You can go to these schools of color. You can ask for applicants of color. You can look for them. And I will tell you, the broadest pool has been, I believe, in the audiences of military service, past military service, as people are rotating out of those positions, intentionally looking for and recruiting members from the community that you're trying to redefine, I think can be outcome determinative. And that's the disconnect that I've seen in looking at law enforcement agencies that are challenged with trying to find applicants of color. One of the things I think that we have to talk about, and there's a whole spectrum of law enforcement agencies out there. It's not just police, it's sheriff, it's DEA, it's FBI, it's all of these things. But specifically in the agencies that don't require a BA or a college degree, or just require an AA, are you going and meeting with recruiters at those local city colleges that also, I mean, we want to talk about disparities in education, a lot of those city colleges have a lot of those communities of color. And are you recruiting there with those folks that are coming out with degrees in criminal justice, that have an interest in defining public safety? And again, I think the issue is in the intentionality. How are you defining intentionality for your agency, looking for those people? Tell me what you're doing to try and bring those people in, and I can address that. I would say a lot of it is defined though with that intentionality. And you didn't quite ask this question, but I'm just going to tell you one of the things that I think is important too at the federal level. The sentencing disparities that are built into prosecution are some of the highest race disparities that we have in this country. And I would put that at the top of my list of things that need to be fixed at the federal level, that I'm hoping are addressed in this administration. That's my answer.
We have a question from a member of the audience asking for a comment on his thought that some Black leaders in Minneapolis have spoken out against city council's moves to defund the police.
Yes.
And what your thoughts are on that. And I would like to add to that a secondary question. You've spoken a lot about data and the importance of data and transparency in dealing with data. My sense is that there are probably a whole variety of studies that are being done out in our country at the moment in different places. And some of them are probably coming out with very opposing perspectives. And we live in a world now in which it's hard to know what the facts really are or what the truth of the facts really are. How do we determine that?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, but let me just start with the defund the police, and then I'm going to shift into the data collection. So I think the wide number of voices that you're hearing on defund the police are different interpretations of the same thing. Again, like I said, I think at the core, it's a challenge to budget allocations for policing. And some of the criticism that we're hearing are from folks that feel like we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We want the police, we don't want to pay for disparities. And being able to parcel that out, I think, is the core of both the problem and part of the challenge. That I think it's a shortcut in analysis to say that you're saying defund the police. That means that you are saying you hate all police and that we can't have policing moving forward. And I don't think that that is accurate, although there are groups and audiences that feel like that's exactly what they are arguing for. And again, defund the police is a spectrum of arguments and a spectrum of challenges to law enforcement. And when you try and analyze the call for defund the police by looking at those polar margins, I think it's a really difficult conversation to have. And the bigger picture is really, how do we address funds that are allocated in this society for policing, and then what are those funds tied to? I think that's the answer. That's the big answer that brings more people to the table. And quite frankly, the broader that table having that discussion, the better your definition of public safety for that jurisdiction. And let me be clear that public safety is always a partnership. And if you are trying to define your public safety and don't have communities of color at that table, and you don't have the LGBT community at that table, you don't have women at that table, you are going to have problems. And even if those problems are just perceived from whatever community feels marginalized, it's going to be built into your system and be a backdoor of frustration for the communities, and they're not going to work effectively with law enforcement.
So the members of the Black community in Minneapolis who were critical of some of the council's proposals, is that because they have a different perspective or misunderstand?
I would imagine that if you asked each of them, they would define it a little bit differently. I'm just saying what's at the core of those challenges are the funds that are allocated for law enforcement agencies. And for whatever reason, right, people will interpret that and make that argument differently, but that is at the core of what the defund the police movement is about. And you know what I mean? Like, you can parcel it out in any number different of ways, and there are different arguments that are being made across the board. It's just hard to put a blanket definition on what was specifically said in Minneapolis. And then the second part of your question was, how do we come up with all of these different options, and how do we know which data sets we're relying on? I believe that we have to rely on evidence-based data. And the key that you're talking about that I think was missing is the analysis of that data, right? The stats will speak for themselves, and they are what they are. In any local jurisdiction, here is what the use of force was in this quarter, or in this year, or in this month. Take this snapshot, and when you say, look at this disproportionality in terms of who got stopped, look at the disproportionality in terms of your use of force, look at the disproportionality in terms of who was incarcerated and those lengths of being incarcerated. I know many people are not going to have the answer why, but if you're not asking the questions, we're not going to get to the answers. And the analysis is equally important. Let's figure out, are these training issues? Are we training our officers in the right way to actually look for evidence-based stops, so that we know what the hit rate is for people that are being searched? So, in meaning, if you look and compare who is being stopped and searched, and you overlay the analysis of who actually is charged with crimes, are there disparities there? And maybe that's part of the problem, but we have to start having these conversations and not allow these disparities, once we know that they exist, to just pass like water under the bridge, because that's how we got to where we are right now. And that's why I still think data, all of the data, is important. You have to just start asking questions of the data that we're collecting to say, what are we doing with this data? How are we translating this data into an opportunity to find new solutions to address the disparities that we've been sustaining as a society for a very long period of time? I know that was a long answer, but this presentation is normally like a 3 or 4 hour presentation, and you gave me 40 minutes, so I gotta.
And we are grateful to you for everything that you're giving us. Really, the whole point here is for our community to engage in an educational process so that there can be increased conversations together. And you're helping us a great deal. Well, one of the questions that was asked was about bail reform. It's one of the ideas that's suggested as helping to decrease this disparity. Do you feel that bail reform will have an impact on the disparities in the criminal justice system?
Absolutely. And one of the ways that that happens is in addressing who stays in custody. So over 80%, 80, and I'll just use San Francisco as an example, 82% of the folks that are incarcerated have not been convicted. And when you look at our jail system, and that is because they can't get out, they can't afford bail, and people because of the economic disparities, bail is an unfair factor to evaluate who should stay in custody because it's not reflective of propensities for violence or public safety. It's a random factor. It's not a random factor, but it is an unjustified factor to define race neutral evaluation of public safety risks. Does that make sense? And so, for instance, here in San Francisco, the last time I looked at our statistics, African Americans, and there's a whole out migration here. And so African Americans in San Francisco are 3.9% of the population. 3.9. That makes me like a unicorn here. But in our jail population, we are 52% of the jail population. And again, 82% of those folks that are in custody have not been convicted of a crime or have not been convicted of the crime that they are charged with. That's a real thing. And when you're talking about poor communities, and I got a whole nother lecture on economic disparities because that's a really fascinating one as well. But in a city like San Francisco, where African Americans make up 72.3% of the folks that are in public housing, poverty is a real issue. And so when you combine the two and you evaluate your participation or your sustained incarceration in the criminal justice system based on factors like bail, which again is not the best indicator of public safety or risks, you end up with disproportionate incarceration from the very beginning of our criminal justice system. And that's before you start having the conversation about the disparate impact that incarceration has on communities of color and their economic impacts on things like housing and on occupation and workforce, where, if someone is kept in custody, and, again, these are not just my thoughts and insights, these are proven standards and statistics that you can look at. If you put someone in custody longer than 3 to 5 days, the repercussions of that based on economic limitations in terms of workforce, in terms of education, in terms of housing, and you start taking away some of these things, and this is before, or if anyone is charged with a crime is something different, it really speaks to more disparities, especially when you start talking about on the back end, like with reentry. Again, that's another conversation, but our reentry population for even a city like San Francisco that has over 1,500 people returning into the city every single year with felony convictions, and what that means in terms of the restrictions that are put upon people they're just not justifiable. And if we know better, we can do better. And so I'm a strong proponent of bail review or bail evaluation to be taken out of the factor for incarceration.
So there's also a question about about sorting out issues of misdemeanors and felonies. You just talked about the impact of felonies. By and large, the public tends to think about crime as the serious stuff,
Yeah.
murders, robberies, assaults, and like that. But there are more misdemeanors which sound less serious, but can have serious consequences.
You want me to speak to that?
Yeah, I just want to. I want to see if I can just get the rest of this question here. Um, so the question the question is, who has the discretion to determine what a person is charged with? Is it the police? Is it a district attorney? And given the serious consequences, uh, how does this impact in a disparate way the community of Black people and people of color?
Yeah. So I will tell you that authority resides with prosecutors. And that's why it's so important that we have prosecutors that are focused on this issue, because statistically, they also, communities of color, are charged disproportionately in the criminal justice system. And there's a subjective element to interpreting what is going to be a felony versus what is going to be a misdemeanor, oftentimes for the exact same offense. And I'll give you some examples. If, let's say, there is an assault and there is, let's say, I punched someone, or someone has punched someone, and there's bleeding on the lip. That could be argued both ways. That's a felony. That's a serious injury, but that's a subjective analysis that's almost case by case. It takes place in a location that I determine as a prosecutor is not just a group of people fighting, but that's a gang because it's in this location and other people that are in the area were involved in gangs. These are all subjective. These are all subjective analyses that increase or influence who gets charged, and not just who gets charged, but how they get charged. And that distinction made between misdemeanors and felonies is a key one that is outcome determinative for folks that are brought into the system and exit the system. And I'll explain in that the distinction between misdemeanors and felonies is how much custody time you'll be doing. And so if you are charged with the misdemeanor, the maximum amount of time that you can spend in custody is 365 days. That means that you're in a jail. If you are charged with an offense that is a felony, that means your offense is going to put you in custody more than 365 days. And that's anywhere from 1 year to whatever it is, indefinitely, a life imprisonment. That is what felonies are. And so that's also the distinction made when you talk about misdemeanors and felonies. You commit misdemeanors, you go to jail. You commit felonies, you're in prison. And that's the distinction as well. You cannot be in jail for over 365 days. That's just another little subtlety that a lot of people may not understand about our criminal justice system. Did I
Well,
answer the question?
yeah, I think you did, and I appreciate it. Yeah. There are also, in all of these areas, local, state, and federal laws that deal with policing and other issues of the criminal justice system. And the reality in our country is that there are red states and there are blue states, and they have different kinds of laws and different systems.
Yes.
Do you see a way forward for our nation to address this? We know that the Senate is split and fighting each other tooth and nail on a lot of these issues.
Yeah. So I get frustrated with politics like everyone else does in this country. And regardless of the side of the fence that you're on, I think issues like this of race disparities in our criminal justice system are just things that we have to address or that are important to everyone. And once we are made aware of what some of these numbers are about disparities, I don't know how we continue without becoming advocates ourselves or trying to make these changes or doing something to move that needle. And you're right, everyone will reinterpret these options about what to do differently, not just on the different sides of the fence on whether you're an independent or a Democrat or a Republican, but also what the proper approach is at a federal level, a state level, and a local level. I believe that the advocacy can take place on all of those levels of wherever we want to focus our voices and focus our attention. I think the initiatives being taken at the federal government are important, and they define what takes place at the state level and the local level, because whatever isn't addressed at the federal level is left by default to state and local jurisdictions. And that's why I spent so much time outlining what's in the George Floyd Act, both from the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, because whatever is left in or isn't approved is left for the states to take up. And that means advocating with and through our state attorney generals and advocating individually on our ballots about initiatives that come up. But before we even get to that level of action, we can take actions at a local level by engaging and asking questions of our mayors, of our board of supervisors and commissioners and chiefs of police about things, and getting involved and stating what our opinions are, and their local votes as well. For me, I'm that guy that writes those emails, and I want to know, what is your position on bail reform? What is your position on death penalty? That's a whole nother conversation too. But what is your position on use of force? And are you in support of evaluating use of force into adopting best practices? I mean, who's going to say they're against that? But not just asking those questions, but holding our elected officials accountable for those things, and appointed officials too that work in law enforcement, I think is really important. And yes, it can be overwhelming, but I believe that once we know better, we can do better. And when we have conversations like this, I think it's so important that we are able to hear what everyone has to say. And to the degree you hear something that resonates with you, you can focus on that, and you can make sure that you are doing something to help move that needle to improve the outcomes, not just for ourselves, but for our whole communities, for our cities. And so I know it's easy to be overwhelmed and be frustrated with the politics of all of it, but I'm constantly reminding myself of the folks that have experiences like myself that are unfair and don't need to be. And I'm perpetuating those things that are unfair by not focusing on them, by not speaking truth to them, or not making them more known to broader audiences. Oftentimes, I'll start even a conversation like the one that we're having tonight, asking how many folks have been detained or arrested by law enforcement. I have been detained and arrested over 8 times. The last time I was stopped was at gunpoint by law enforcement for, I think it was a gang homicide. Now, before you all look at me with judgment, I was not involved in the gang homicide. And at the time, I was the chief at the DA's office in a suit, but I lived in a neighborhood that was predominantly African American. And so my experiences, I am aware, are different from other people's experiences. By the way, those other 7 times were everything from fare evasion to armed robbery. By the way, I committed none of these crimes. I'm just telling you what I've been detained and arrested for in the past. But we live in a world where our shared experiences are different. And we have to be able to talk about those shared experiences to inform why we have the problem that we have, and that we have the problem that we have. And before we just analyze even just the narratives that we each may bring to the table, I think you can elevate that and just focus on the data. What is the data telling us? And that, to me, defines the problem that allows us to look for a solution. I've totally forgotten your question now and just went off on my own tangent, but
When you go off, it's really wonderful. You give us a lot of things to think about. And what you just said is so important to me. It's critical to me. We think we have shared experience in this country, but we really
yes,
do not have shared experience.
right. That is
It's
correct.
hard to know how other people are perceived in the world and how they are treated.
Yeah, and we all receive that information differently. Some people need to hear individual narratives as an affirmation for them. Some people need to see statistics. Some people need to do their own work and find out independently because they don't trust the source of what they're finding out, which is why I think the transparency of this data is so important. But it's equally important that we are analyzing that data. And I think people really get frustrated because they feel like, hey, look, that Paul Henderson, he is brilliant. See how I threw that in there? But he's a lawyer and he has the tools that I don't have and I don't know and I don't understand. And that's not the standard by which we all become advocates. My goal in this conversation tonight is for everyone that is here that heard something to feel like hopefully they've learned a little bit more about something and they take that and disseminate it. I think our silence is part of the problem. And we all are advocates in that we have the opportunity to share our knowledge and to share our experiences with other folks, if no one else, our families and friends, because we can't expect others to care more about these issues than we do. And our silence is that adoptive admission that there's nothing wrong or that we agree with our systems in the way that they are. And we can do better, but we can't do better without the conversations like this, which is why I think, and I was so eager to come here tonight, the fact that you wanted to have this kind of conversation is a first step towards a solution. And I hope that people take away from this conversation the opportunity, you don't have to like me or my presentation, but to explore more and to find voices that speak into some of these more difficult subject matters like race and to follow them. That's an easy way to take a first step. If you do nothing else, find a voice that you hear that resonates with you or that you identify with or that you think is credible in an area and follow them on Twitter, become friends with them on Facebook, set your TiVo to listen to them when they're speaking, be their friend on Instagram, and listen to some of the things that they're saying. And that's how you learn. That's how you hear from other people. And I think there are different ways to find that more palatable than not, and that's a personal judgment, but amplifying those voices and reposting that on your Facebook page, I think sends messages to your friends that, hey, I care about this. I learned about this. I think it's important. Are you tracking it? Do you want to talk about it? Here are my thoughts about it. That's how we begin to change. And it's also how we send the message to others that we care about the communities that we live in beyond just the communities that we define that are self-reflections, that go to the same worship in the same way that we do, or praise the same way that we do, or our judgment in the ways that we believe we are judgmental, because that's all subjectively interpreted. So,
Well, that's a good segue into two questions that
yeah.
we received about our local community. One is, do we have a police oversight commission in San Mateo? The second question you've answered in a number of different ways, but it would be helpful if you could describe again quickly how people in our community can research practices in our own police department in San Mateo.
Okay, so let me start with, I know there's an oversight agency in San Jose. I don't recall offhand if there's one in San Mateo. I just don't recall. I don't think there is, but I hate to say it because if there is, and then it'll be like, oh, look, Paul Henderson snubbed us and he didn't even acknowledge. So I don't think that there is, but I'm not sure. You can find out easily by calling the chief of police's office and asking them, or probably the mayor's office would know. There is, like I said, a nod towards addressing and inspiring and motivating more counties to have civilian oversight agencies in the George Floyd bill, but we don't need to wait for that if it's something that you're interested in. And there's a national agency, let me acknowledge them, NACOLE, NACOLE, which is the National Association of Law Enforcement Oversight, that folks can look to for guidance about what these agencies do. And there's a million different ways to build them in terms of individual jurisdictions. The solutions that we have here in San Francisco may not be a solution for Riverside or other counties. And so there's not one specific model to look at. But in terms of defining the need for those civilian oversight agencies and defining the disparities that exist, this goes to the second part of your question. The questions to ask are from your chiefs and or elected officials things that I think are clear indicators that there are race disparities in your law enforcement agencies are definitions for use of force overlaid with race. So the first question is, have you renewed or redrafted your policies for use of force? If that answer is no, there's more than half of your answer right there, because that means, as I said earlier, if you have not updated your use of force policies, you are still subjectively using techniques and subjectively executing tactics that are no longer best practices, not just for communities of color, but for officers themselves. And then the secondary question is, to the degree you are measuring these things, let me see your records about use of force and communities of color. It's a bigger travesty if the agencies are not even tracking these things. Again, we can't fix what we don't talk about. I may write that down because that's a good tweet. But the issue is, if we are not collecting that information at a local level, you can still look independently at a statewide level for the 96A report in California is what it's called, where law enforcement agencies are forced to evaluate at the bare minimum some standards of race in terms of law enforcement activities. And that will be one of the signs. You can look it up by county as confirmation that, oh my gosh, look at that Paul Henderson, he was right. There are some race disparities that I wasn't even aware of. And now that you know, what will we do? How do we get that Paul Henderson to come save the world here? Or whomever you choose to be your champion.
There will probably be many, but you would be on the list too. Director Henderson, are there nonprofits that you recommend that are working on the racial disparity in the criminal justice system?
Oh boy. Yeah, there's a lot of them. I'm going to start with the 8 Can't Wait campaign, Colors of Change organization. They did the 8 Can't Wait for discussing specifically law enforcement reforms that need to get done. I think it's a great introduction for the nation to deal with law enforcement and policing. I would love to see an agency that does something like 4 for More. I just made that up, but it's like a beyond just understanding that they have issues. And a lot of the jurisdictions that do have civilian oversight, how do we connect the dots and to take the next steps into taking the next steps beyond the transparency and the data collection, right? Like, and those are some of the more difficult obligations that I think we have to do in terms of analyzing the data and implementing solutions from a policy perspective to create rules for our law enforcement agencies to follow. It's an esoteric practice of law enforcement. So the policies have to be esoteric as well, but targeted and specific. And we have to elevate these conversations beyond just a demand for justice and a demand to eliminate bias into specific tactics and actions and rules that we can follow, pass, and enforce with our law enforcement agencies. And so that's my answer.
Thank you. And as we're coming to the end of our time together, I've saved this question for the very end.
Californians for Justice and Rosenstein Center are some too. I'm just starting to think now more shifting to talking about agencies, but go ahead. Sorry.
So in your very beginning opening of your comments, you told a story about walking into a courtroom and the judge thought you were the accused. So what happened? What happened when you told the judge that you were the prosecutor? Was there an apology? Was there an awkward silence?
It's so funny you said that. It's so funny. Every time I tell that story, everybody wants to go back and be like, "Who was the judge? Yeah. What happened?" But I will tell you, I'm not going to identify the judge.
Good deal.
But the judge, an older white gentleman, was like, "Oh, sorry, he didn't really care." and just blew it off. And it was like, oh, I didn't know because you were standing there. But what was unsaid was like, because of course I said, I am the prosecutor. I'm the new prosecutor assigned here in this courtroom. And the interesting part of it was, you know, when you get an assignment like that, like, look, you got me, and he had me for another 6 to 8 months every single day coming into that courtroom. So this was something that we had to deal with and we had to address. I will say, as a result of it, and this again began my part of the trajectory for me, what I thought and acknowledged was, we need to hire more people that are here making decisions like this that look like me and come from my community. And my first knee-jerk reaction was, I went to the front office and asked to sit on the hiring committee. Now, this was not well received on my first day. That I wanted to sit on the hiring committee with all of 4 hours of experience as an attorney. But what I learned was that the hiring committee would reach out with the senior prosecutors that were all in Mahogany Row to try and get 4 people to sit on the panels for hiring. And those people were always busy and in trial. So when I knew, I made friends with the Black secretary that was one of the Black secretaries. So when I knew interviews were taking place, I would hang out in the hallways and look for opportunities to be pulled into the hiring committees to help support and encourage a broader definition of who should be a prosecutor and who could be a prosecutor. And ultimately, obviously, when I became chief and took over the hiring, one of the things that I'm most proud of with then District Attorney Kamala Harris was increasing the diversity in that office by over 85%. And that means opening the doors to women, to communities of color, to the LGBT communities, to better define who the administrators of justice were from the criminal justice system and prosecution. And so that, I think, was a good ending to that story. That, and I talk about the story often when I talk to law students about, you're going to encounter things that are going to frustrate you and make you angry. Don't let those experiences define you and close your door into doubling down, into making change and using your voice in ways that are effective and not reflective in ways that are negative. Your depression and your anger is only perpetuated if you aren't changed by the situation and you don't work to change the situation. I'm not saying everything you do is right, and certainly not everything I did was right, but there was an intentionality and my reaction to things that was negative that I think can be measured. And that's all I ask of people. Do your part. And if you can't do your part, do something in order to make sure that you don't let these things pass. And you don't internalize these things as a reflection of yourself where you feel diminished because of someone else's ignorance. It's something that should be addressed, but there are steps that you can take, and you can't do it if you're not talking about it. Share it with a friend, share it with a mentor, develop a mentor, and talk about this with your peers in terms of finding solutions if you don't have one yourself. The other agency I want to mention before you close me out, I forgot this one too, was For the People. That's another agency, a nonprofit that's led by Hillary Blount, who is also a prosecutor. Previously, she was actually one of my interns, and now she runs this agency that addresses race disparities as well here in the Bay Area.
Director Henderson, we are profoundly grateful to you for spending this time with us this evening and for giving us a presentation that will cause in our community, I hope, a great deal of thought, even soul searching.
Yeah.
So much important information, so much to think about. We are really, really grateful. And just a little while ago, you said, when we know better, we can do better.
Yeah.
And this, I think, is what produced this program in our community. We want to know better so that we can do better. And I hope that this phrase, when we know better, we can do better, is something we will say in our community to each other over and over and over again, to remind us that especially in the Jewish community, we have a responsibility of tikkun olam, repairing the world. We have a responsibility to make our community better. And to do that, we're going to have to educate ourselves again and again and again so that we can do what we're called upon to do. Thank you ever so much for being with us tonight. We are truly grateful.
Thank you so much for having me. By the way, I stole that from Oprah, so it's,
Okay.
it doesn't make it any less true, but it's an accurate statement. And I honestly, in doing this work, I get really frustrated, right? I watch the news and I get angry. I read the paper and it makes me upset. It's the little bright lights of hope that inspire me in my work. And it's audiences like this that people want to have conversations that are not easy. They're hard conversations, and these are hard facts, but I reference them as facts. You don't get to say there's no race disparities in our justice system. You don't get to say there's no race disparities in policing. I just want to provide tools to folks so that they can learn and we can all make better decisions as a community. And so I thank you, not just for having me, but I love the discussions that you've been having, and I've been watching the previous ones as well. And I'm inspired by the volume of folks that are drawn not just to you and your voice, but the platform that you're providing for people to make a change for their own communities, because they're all of our communities. So thank you once again for having me. It's been a real pleasure. And I appreciate all of the attention that folks have given me on these things that I think are very important for all of us.
Thank you. And next Thursday evening at 7 p.m., we'll have the third and final part of our series. This session will focus on the state of educational equity in California. Our guide and speaker will be Ms. Natalie Wheathall-Lum. She is the Director of Policy for the Oakland-based organization Education West.
Oh.
I also want to let everyone know that the recording of this evening's program will be available on the PJCC website. That's pjcc.org. It will be available by next Wednesday on our website. And if you want to share it with friends or family, you can find it there. Again, thank you to Director Henderson. Thank you to all of you for being together. I hope you have a really wonderful evening and a very good and pleasant weekend. Good night, everyone.
Thanks again. Good night.